Welcome, everybody. My name is Al Wilson. I am a volunteer with the nonprofit Friends of Mount Moriah Cemetery. We are a nonprofit that is one of three groups in the Mount Moriah Preservation Corporation who are attempting to rehabilitate and give new life to the Mount Moriah Cemetery. This is our second interaction with the Mutter Museum. We're very fond of them. Our first was the flu tour, which they conducted. That was a very well received, and we enjoyed researching with them on that. So they approached us about doing a talk this fall, and we thought no better way than to help our friends at the Mutter Museum deliver content. Rachel and Dana have been very helpful in getting me orientated and organized. The one thing that I took from them was that I have to start out with the drink. So we selected cemetery cider recipe. So I am actually supposed to mix this online during it. So I have my apple cider already. This is my Jim Beam, 2 ounces. Now, you don't have to use this recipe. You can have the one of your own choice. But we decided to have it a little bit themed. The mixer. And now my Bacardi. And finally, off camera, my little bottle of Captain Morgan. This came at a time I went to the liquor store and a robber came in. But he bought stuff, so they didn't report him. So now I'm going to mix it. And I don't know if you can see it. There's my cider. And it goes. So let's get started. That's really good. I wasn't anticipating that. All right. So I am a member of the historical committee. I've been with Mount Moriah for about 5 years. I've been the chairperson of its historical committee. What we're doing is we're researching individuals and we're researching the history of the cemetery. It has a unique footprint inside Philadelphia with its history. There's also a section of it in Yeadon Borough. I'm going to keep the history of it short. It was found in 1855 as part of the rural cemetery movement here in the United States that began in Massachusetts in 1831. It was abandoned in 2011. So after a little while, the Philadelphia Orphans Court formed a corporation that composes of 3 parts: the Friends of Mount Moriah Cemetery, Philadelphia, and Yeadon Borough. And I have to call out both Yeadon and Philadelphia have been tremendous partners in this. So as of 2022, about 70% of the cemetery has been reclaimed, meaning that it has a regular maintenance. We figure there's 180,000 to 200,000 interned. One small fact is that there's at least 26 Congressional Medal of Honor recipients, 2 individuals that have received it twice. They both went in, received the honor, and then re-enlisted under another name and were recipient a second time. And there's a pair of brothers from the Civil War that are buried together that were also Congressional Medal of Honors. So one of the things that the rural cemetery reflects is a modern day equivalent of you're not forgotten if somebody remembers your name. And so we try to honor that tradition when we have, say, our events like the Wreaths Across America, where when we place wreaths on veterans' graves, we actually say their name so that they're not forgotten. So the rural cemetery movement came from a time when cities were getting crowded. It was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the city was dirty. You had horses going through, people were buried all around. And quite frankly, cities started looking at the cemeteries and saying, boy, those are really valuable pieces of real estate. And so that combined into a movement that led to landscaped cemeteries, where before it was a church graveyard, and when you were buried, you got the next plot, and you really didn't have much way of individually remembering people because everything in the cemetery or the graveyard for the church was pretty much the same. So the idea was to have an area that was fresh air, it was landscaped, people could go to it, and it wouldn't be owned by the church. Individuals would actually own their own plots. And there's a lot of evidence to show that these cemeteries that were formed at that time really played that up. And it was also a business investment. So you see different groups or wealthy people buying really large plots that could handle 80 people, and then they would subdivide that and allow people to buy individual graves. So that way, if the wealthy individual was famous, you could say that your plot was near that wealthy individual. So this is a map from PhiladelphiaArchaeology.net that details the historical graveyards. And what you can see here is how much of the original center city actually had graveyards in there. And what ended up happening was that because these were valuable estates, they wanted to use them for factories, they wanted to use them for people, they literally picked up these interred bodies and over time moved them out to these cemeteries, which were considered rural. And by rural, we're talking West Philadelphia. So Mount Moriah itself rests half in Philadelphia, and then over Cobbs Creek, the rest is in Yeadon Borough. This is a blow up of the map that I was just showing you. So it shows you how, if you consider this area at the bottom right as the original Philadelphia, people were being buried here. You can see they've overlaid it. There was a huge cemetery where University of Pennsylvania and Children's Hospital is located, and then the Woodland Cemetery, which is part of the rural cemetery movement. So I'd like to point out that one of the people that this affected was Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross was buried in the Quaker burial grounds of Fifth and Arch, and she passed away in 1836, and her remains were disinterred and brought out to Mount Moriah. And as the story goes, about 1975, there was an effort to bring her body back to the Betsy Ross house. And that's a completely another story that could literally take us another hour to discuss. This is a picture of a recent dedication. The various revolutionary groups associated, like the Daughters of the American Revolution, there's several of them, I can't name them all, but they dedicated a plaque at the site of Betsy's grave. If you look here at this original photo, that's the plaque. That's where we think she was buried. But this stone to the left of the lady in blue is actually her daughter. So they picked her up from what would be considered her family plot. Her daughter had gotten buried next to her, and then they took her back to the city. So one of the attributes of burial traditions at this time was gatehouses. So this is from a brochure. We think it's around 1910, 1920 of Mount Moriah main entrance. This is made by an architect that was famous at the time, Stephen Decatur Button. And it was symbolic of the traditions of the time that you were leaving the city, you were entering into a realm that was solemn, you could get fresh air, and it was a social gathering. And there's little debate right at the moment that the modern day parks like Fairmount Park, Central Park, derivations of this idea. The rural cemetery movement really came first before the America's investment in large parks and big cities. This is what it looks like in their original documentation. What I want to point out here is another burial tradition, at least in Philadelphia. There's a statue on top of this picture, which is Father Time. And whoever's the owner gets to do what they want. So that statue was moved to right behind John Jones, who was an owner at the time, and he moved it back onto his grave when he died. And that's what it looks like today. This is a picture of a gatehouse in Pennsylvania. It's not Philadelphia, but it's in Pennsylvania. And the reason I mention it is because this is the same architect. Does anyone recognize this place? I'm going to give you the hit. This is Gettysburg. You might recognize it from this picture. So this is a picture of that same gatehouse after the Battle of Gettysburg. And if you visit, you can see how close the battle was to that exact location. This is a cemetery that was in North Philadelphia, and its gatehouse. What's interesting about this is that it became defunct in about 1920. And eventually Temple purchased the land. They contacted, I think it's 700 people that they could identify as relatives of those interred, but they ended up moving 22,000 bodies or caskets out to another cemetery. And where you might know this is that these stones that were located here were replaced by flat stones in the target cemetery, and the stones themselves actually ended up as riprap, which is stones that are placed on the banks of water to prevent erosion. So these are pictures in the background as of the Betsy Ross Bridge. And all those stones went here to the edge of the Delaware River. If you look at this picture, Betsy Ross is to your left, and in front of you is the train bridge that goes across the Delaware River. This is Laurel Hill Cemetery. This is their gatehouse. Again, what you'll see here is the beginnings of these gatehouses actually being living residents. So a caretaker would be in this house. This is the Woodlands, another rural cemetery that was created during the time in Philadelphia. This is the current state of the gatehouse at Mount Moriah. What you'll notice here is two things. Number one, its level of disrepair. There was a fire in the adjoining buildings which had the caretakers in it, and after that it was uninhabitable. What the Friends of Mount Moriah have done is they're trying to shore it up so no additional damage or it doesn't collapse on itself. The second thing was what you'll notice is the difference with the picture that I showed you before is it used to be the way in, and once the gatehouse had a fire in the 1950s, I would say they just decided, you know what, that's valuable land. We could be making money of it. So they started burying people right in front of it. One of our Facebook members actually lived at the house and was willing to contribute pictures. And this is from the side at the living quarters. So the important part of the rural cemetery movement and burial traditions in Philadelphia was that these were going to be landscaped. They weren't just going to be rows of stones. They were actually going to be trees. There were going to be roads. There was going to be the ability to get some shade and hills. And in the case of Mount Moriah, there was a river that you could go sit by and contemplate things. This is a picture from our archives. What happened to Mount Moriah is at the time of the abandonment, the Friends of Mount Moriah called Philadelphia and said, you know, there's a lot of paper here in the office. You should come get it and put it in a safe place. So Philadelphia has been very nice, and they're actually storing our historical records there for us to go through. And I went through in August and I found this map because one of our owners, the obituary said he was buried at Lagrange, which caught my eye. And this is actually a map of Lagrange. And when we look at a map of about 1850, we see that the area was owned by J.E. Old and a couple other people. And when you overlay the two, you can see that it fits very nicely to the current contours of the cemetery today. And so this was all farmland. What you can see here where I've drawn arrows is that these are all parcels of land. So these owners, Horatio Powell, his wife Elizabeth, John Palmer on the Yaden side, John Palmer pretty much owned the entire cemetery, what would become the cemetery on the Yaden side. All these people had plots and they came together and they formed a business of the cemetery. This had been under the previous owner just farmland. This is a picture that I really like. This is about 1910. And this somewhat represents something significant to me because you can see how flat it is. By this time, 1910, they had pretty much given up on the idea of landscaped as far as hills and trees and stuff. They tried to put as many plots in as possible, and it was becoming a nightmare to maintain the plots as they were, and you'll see some pictures of why. This is a modern day comparison. What I always find interesting, if I could go back in time, I'd love to see if this tree or this leaves on the side are actually still this tree, because this tree is very old, and that would be wonderful to know. This is a Google map of the area. What you can see here is the picture that you saw before is right here under the name, and you can see how clear this is, how easy it is to maintain. But all this area, and this picture is a little bit old, but all this area had unique monuments, had big monuments, had enclosed lots with stone, and they were very difficult to maintain. Same thing over here. A lot of these sections over here are just, even by today's standards, very hard to maintain. So it was a model that was difficult to keep up. One of the attributes is just a matter of timing. This is a picture of the Soldier's Rest. This is a little over 400 individuals that passed away in Philadelphia due to wounds of the Civil War. So what ended up happening was at the time of the Civil War, where about 2% of the United States population died, the US government at least was caught off guard. They didn't have cemeteries. And remember that they thought the war was going to be over in 3 months and it wasn't going to be a big deal. So in West Philadelphia, there was the Satterlee Hospital, which was one of the biggest in the countries for Civil War. And some of these individuals were wounded in Virginia, had to take a train or wagon ride back from Virginia to the hospital in Philadelphia, and ended up dying here. So part of the rural cemetery movement, no matter what state, has been that the U.S. government purchased plots in order to bury their Civil War dead. This is my picture on Christmas time. We have a program called Wreaths Across America where we attempt to put wreaths on all the plots of veterans from these government plots. This is on Memorial Day. Gives you a sense of what it looks like. And then this is a long view, very peaceful. And I think that was the intent, was that it was a solemn and honoring of our veterans. So this was two monuments that were at the North Philadelphia Cemetery. They're now in their new location. That was another aspect of the rural cemetery movement, was that groups could get together and purchase a monument. And the one on the left is to George Washington. The one on the right is Thomas Jefferson. So they were meant to reflect a reverence for what was important at the time. And these were, I want to say, about 1870. So the centennial was about approaching. There was a swirl of patriotism, people trying to understand their history. And so these monuments were put in a place where people could contemplate the philosophy of the individuals. But it was also a way, because people owned their own plots and they could do whatever they wanted with their money. And so this is a picture of what we call Mausoleum Hill in Mount Moriah. And at the end, I have a couple of links. One of them is a talk by the author of the Rural Cemetery Movement book. And he talks about, you can't read too much about these mausoleums other than people had money and they spent it. Because he asked his students, he's a professional historian, what do you make of this? And they said, well, this must be titans of industry or stuff like that. And we've done research on all these people, and there's not a lot significant about them. So it was a prestigious thing. I'm sure it was a marketing ploy to say, we have this area, and don't you want to spend your money to be in this area so people could go by and say, I'm buried near you, or they would say, that must have been a wonderful human being. This is an angle of the Mausoleum Hill from down the road a little bit. Thomas Hoy is the one that's in the back. We've researched him. There's absolutely nothing to suggest that he was a titan of industry. He was a wealthy businessman. The most we could figure about him was he was married in Maine. He divorced his wife, married his wife's aunt, and then moved to Philadelphia. But he's buried with his kids, so apparently they didn't think much of it because they're all there too. I threw this as a pat on my own back. This is a photograph I took at night with my photography club. And in this view, you can see how striking the monuments are when you look at them this way. It was also a way for people to get together and have a tribute to individuals that they admire. This is the tomb of John McCullough. He was an actor in the 1860s. He was notable for Shakespeare. He passed away, and there's a fundraiser in Washington for him. And the lead actor in that play to benefit raising money for this monument was John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was in a play a month before he assassinated Lincoln for John McCullough. So it represented these people that wanted to come by and honor what they thought was a great actor. And as far as the cemetery is concerned, that was great. This is a modern day picture of it. It's actually looking from the reverse angle, but what you'll notice is all the stone around it has been removed. What we believe happened, there was a lot of original plots that had medals, and you can see in the bottom here around the actual memorial. And we think that the cemetery wrote to all the owners and said, it's really getting difficult to maintain these things. We'd like to get rid of them. And oh, by the way, can we use the medal for the war effort around 1918? This is an example of individuality also. This is the grave of two Wilson children. One was approximately 2 years old, one only about 3 months old. This is in section 206 of our cemetery. This is the baker. Obviously, that's what it says on the slide. This becomes significant in a few minutes, but this was a ship captain, and his family, not content, actually has vaults on the Philadelphia side, and the rest of the married family has it on the mausoleum side. So they were very much into this idea. So one of the things I wanted to point out is this little top part. This top part served for two reasons. One, it allowed the gases within the monument to escape. The second is that there is some evidence to suggest that these were equipped with bells. And there was an inordinate amount of fear up until about 1900, maybe a little bit later, of being buried alive. So this is a patent for a coffin that would be attached to your stone. If you were buried alive and you woke up, you could ring a bell and have someone come and get you. And the theory going back here is that if you were buried in a mausoleum, there would be a bell in here that you could ring because you would be locked in. Well, one of the biggest aspects of the rural cemetery movement traditions in Philadelphia was the idea that this was a community and social. So we now have a question for you. What do you think of picnicking in a cemetery?
Al, are you able to see the results?
I am not.
Okay, so I will read them out. It looks like we have a lot of results coming in. It looks like most people are in the camp of, well, that sounds like a great way to remember people. About 83%. Only one person who says, oh no, that's creepy. I don't like that. And then there's a few other people in between, but 83% think it's a nice way to remember past generations.
That's interesting because I get a lot of pushback on the topic. So the reason I mention this is that there was a period of time where that was not only normal but expected. And that's one of the few traditions that has survived. Our Facebook group is full of people that either had relatives that talked about it or they themselves participated. I got Linda's permission to post this picture and I talked to her about it. Her dad talked about it all the time. And this is a 1932 picture. So that tradition survived from 1830 all the way to 1932 at Mount Moriah in particular. Plus, I also asked for permission. This is 1919. This person didn't indicate, but we were lucky that I was able to grab some individual pictures of the parents. But it's still occurring today. So Ken Smith is on the line. He's our president of the Friends of Mount Moriah. And there are people each spring that come out to Mount Moriah and have a good time. They talk about their relatives, their memories of their relatives, lay out food, have food drinks. This is the Brascos. John Brasco, we looked up. He fought in World War I, and that's one of the things that we're doing, is we're trying to remember these people and put together an archive so that way people can understand the backgrounds of the individuals that are buried there. We're trying to remember Louis Bassett. If you understand Philadelphia business, Bassett's Ice Cream is buried at Mount Moriah. And we contacted them and asked them if they were willing to participate in an activity. National Ice Cream Day is in July. So they drove their truck out. We had a social gathering of about 80 people. And then they gave out some ice cream in honor of their ancestor. So these are our 4 family members of the Bassett family. We made sure the stone was set upright, and it was just a very social experience. It was very heartwarming. They were somewhat overwhelmed. This was the first time they had ever actually seen where their founder was buried. We also are having events at Mount Moriah, and that's why I asked the question about what do you think. This is twofold. One is to get people to understand the importance of the cemetery. The other is at this point unlikely that it will resume full business, and in order to upkeep the cemetery, we're needing to find new ways to generate revenue. So this is what's known as a darksome craft. It's all Halloween related. We have nature tours, we have historical tours, and we're just trying to get the word out and have people interested in this cemetery. I threw this in here because it's not so unusual. This caught my eye a couple years ago where this man had promised his father if the Cubs ever got into the World Series, they'd listen to the game together. So he drove from Indiana down to his father in, I think it was the Carolinas, and listened to the game on his phone at the foot of the grave of his father. So it's not too unusual, but this caught my eye because they made a really big deal out of it. I put together 2 books and a video, The Rural Cemetery Movement and a YouTube video by Jeff Smith, the original author, who gave a talk in Missouri about his book and about how rural cemeteries fit into the history. And his point was that cemeteries are a reflection of society and how they're not places for the dead, they're really places for the living. Thank you very much. My contact information is here on the slide, and now we'll go to some questions.
Thanks, Al. That was wonderful. For everyone tuning in, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. I see a couple in the chat and I will try to get to them, but it's a lot easier if they're in the Q&A box. No harm if you repeat yourself in there. The questions really range, but I'll start off with one for you personally. What brought you to Mount Moriah Cemetery? What made you interested in doing all this research, and how did you get here?
As described in my bio, I am an amateur genealogist. My family was from Philadelphia. I actually moved to Philadelphia in 1991. I followed the history of it in the newspaper, of all things. But it wasn't until I took a little of a break from my genealogy, and it wasn't until my kids got a little bit older that I got back into it. And I was like, at 100,000, 180,000 people, I wonder if some of my relatives are buried there. It turned out that I don't directly have anyone. I have a cousin whose mother by marriage had a veteran buried in Mount Moriah. She often mentioned how her family was devastated. He was killed in New Guinea in 1943. His body was repatriated in 1949 at Mount Moriah. That part of the family was buried there. So I thought I would come out, visit his grave. Again, I'm very big into photography. There is a site called Find a Grave that encourages volunteers to take pictures of stones so that others can find their relatives. So I wanted to take a picture of the grave for my cousin. And I went out there. I knew the exact spot it was within 4 feet. I went out there within 4 feet of the actual stone. I was anticipating it was on the ground and could not find it. So it was a full 2.5 years before a lawnmower found it. It was under a good 4 or 5 inches of dirt. That's how long it had not seen the sunlight. And then I was hooked because during that period of time, about once a week on the Facebook group, maybe a little less than once a week, maybe every 2 weeks, someone comes out to the cemetery or someone posts on there like, I know I have somebody there. Can somebody tell me where they're buried, or who else is buried there? And there's a great satisfaction amongst the volunteers to help people reunite with their family history, and to honor people. So we concentrate very much on the police officers that buried there. We concentrate on the veterans, but every day on the Facebook group, someone says, can someone look this up? Or I don't know whether there's a stone. And we have a couple of volunteers that are very good at finding them. They have a metal prod and they go and they look to see if it's buried there or not.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's amazing how many people are interested in learning more. And I think once you start, you're hooked, like you're saying. Is there a specific purpose to the gatehouses at these cemeteries? And if so, what does that serve?
So they were philosophical and they were practical. The philosophical part was to note the difference between the city and the cemetery. This is at a period of time where there were no sewers, there was horses defecating in the streets, and this was pretty much a pristine, healthful area. So you were actually entering into an area where you were encouraged to take a deep breath, that you were amongst friends. It was the beginning of not viewing death as something to be solemn about, like at a church graveyard, but rather to be celebrated. And then the gatehouse didn't start out with facilities at Mount Moriah, but later on, I think the movement went, oh, well, we have people going through this one little entrance. Let's put a business office and put a house there so that way, we can catch them. There's a bunch of stories of just like today of, while people were trying to bury or as they came in, you would try to upsell them and say, well, wouldn't this look better if you had a barrier between you and your neighbors, or, you had metal railings and things like that.
Interesting. Did Mount Moriah in the past, or do they currently have anything in place or any guards in place to ward off against grave robbers? And if so, how did they do that?
I don't know much about the grave robbers, but that was another purpose of having people live at the cemetery. So we do have one individual that self-identified. He lived at the cemetery from 1957 to 1981, and his father was hired as the night watchman. So he just wandered around the cemetery, and this individual told us stories about him catching people, and mostly it sounded like people who were drinking or, partying in the cemetery. He did talk about one crazy person that was just wanted to run around naked in the cemetery, and was armed. That was their primary method of security, was to have someone on the grounds patrolling it at night.
Gotcha. But that does not currently exist, correct? Having someone
Uh,
stay there and patrol.
so the offices had been abandoned. They were in physically bad shape. I mean, it does have an apartment on top. We might refurbish it. The current plans are in flux. We do have security though. They're not totally unwatched at this moment.
Gotcha.
Our
That's good to know.
the biggest problem right now is dumping. You're cleaning out a house, you load it up, you have to pay for there's a temptation of going to a green spot and just dumping refrigerators, dumping tires, and so
Mhm.
that's our biggest concern. And we now have barriers and other security mechanisms to try to prevent that.
Gotcha. So this is multi-parts, but someone asked in the chat, are all or most cemeteries in the United States privately owned? And did that transition at some period of time? Is the first part. I'll let
Yeah.
you answer that one.
So so this was the Great Transition. They were owned by actual churches before this, and these are private corporations. This was the first time that occurred. Their business model was this was undeveloped land, so they were very big into selling plots ahead of time to gain the money in order to develop the land. So there's evidence to suggest some of that was speculative, like I mentioned before, where someone will buy a big plot for, and I'm making a number up, $1,000, and it might contain 100 plots, but then they would sell those plots at 100 each and make a profit off of it. If an individual plot might have cost 200, so both benefited. A person could buy a plot in a location that they might not be able to afford it, but the original owner was able to make out a lot better. And those were all private transactions.
Gotcha. And so the second kind of related part of the question is someone mentioned a tradition of burying loved ones on private land, on personal land, specifically in the South during different periods of American history. Do we know of any of that in Pennsylvania or in Philadelphia, of anything that happened like that?
Yes, yes. Again, this was the transition in the 1850s, 1860s. You were either buried on a private plot outside the city, or so if you look at the records and where the people died, everybody was inside the city. And the cemeteries that were what are now called the suburbs was everybody outside the city on private plots. So this was the great transition for the country to make the cemetery business a for-profit effort.
Interesting. So some of this is about Mount Moriah specifically. Someone said that they thought Mount Moriah, or they think of Mount Moriah as a historically Black cemetery. Was this the case at any point? Are there different sections of the cemetery that are for different people? How did that work?
I'm going to work my way backwards in time. So Mount Moriah is the only cemetery, to our knowledge, within the city limits that for a period of time accepted Muslim burials. And there are at least three sections that are dedicated to their burials, which has particular rules. The person must be buried within 24 hours. The person's not buried with a casket. And so there's specific sections within there. Prior to that, it's a non-denominational cemetery. That was one of the marks of the rural cemetery movement that I didn't mention. So we do have African Americans. We do have Jewish people. There's actually a court case about this. Henry Jones was an African American in the 1870s that died, and his backstory was him and his wife were caterers, very prominent caterers in Philadelphia. Her sister died about 6 months before her husband, so she was buried at Mount Moriah. 6 months later, her husband died. When her husband died, she put a notice in the paper that he was going to be buried at Mount Moriah. She sent a letter out to Mount Moriah saying, I'm coming tomorrow to bury my husband. And the secretary of the board met her at the gate and wouldn't let her come in, and said that overnight there was this whole campaign by owners of plots that they didn't want an African American man buried here. And she replied, well, I don't understand. You already have African Americans buried here, so what seems to be the problem? But they were responding apparently to pressure. And she's one of those individuals that bought a plot off of somebody else. So it went all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And what they ruled was, because Mount Moriah had changed their tune, they wouldn't admit that they're discriminating. What they ended up saying was she was not the legal owner of the plot because the paperwork hadn't been filed out. And what the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court said, that was true, that she hadn't filed the paperwork. And it's notable that the original owner said, I didn't bother because you lost all my other paperwork. I didn't feel like filing this paperwork. But what they said was there was no prohibition to whomever the actual owner wanted to bury. So if the transfer wasn't proper, then the actual owner decides who's buried there. And he said he wanted Henry Jones to be buried there. So they ruled that Mount Moriah had to take him. But about 3 years have passed, and our evidence suggests that neither him or his wife is buried at Mount Moriah. The sister still is, but there's no evidence to suggest he ever made it back.
Okay. So we have a couple other Mount Moriah questions. So I think I know who this person is in the Q&A. But they mentioned that a lot of College of Physician fellows, a lot of the physicians and from our organization are buried at the Woodland Cemetery. Do you know if there are any 19th century physicians, prominent physicians or physicians buried at Mount Moriah?
The answer is yes. We have someone researching. There's a lot of prominent Civil War surgeons buried at Mount Moriah. So I can't name the individuals myself, but we do have the research on that. The one that strikes me is Stephen Beale, Beale, and I could probably bring it up on the screen. He married a niece of Betsy Ross, so they're all buried somewhat near each other. He was the founder of the University of Dentistry at the University of Pennsylvania. I think he would qualify. And so we've had a couple of inquiries about him and where he's buried, and that the area that he's buried in was recently cleared in the last, I want to say 12 to 18 months. He has a very large stone. His son, Joseph Beale, was an artist, and if you've ever seen the patriotic picture of the fifer, the drummer, and the guy with a bandana around his head from a wound, he drew that. He's also the person that drew Santa Claus for the original "'Twas the Night Before Christmas."
Okay. Well, you mentioned Betsy Ross, and I know you mentioned this in the presentation. Can you remind us again when Betsy Ross was moved to Mount Moriah? And I'm not sure if you mentioned why she was moved to Mount Moriah.
So yeah, she died in about 1833, and she was moved purely because they wanted that spot. So it was part of the rural cemetery movement, and the reasons for different churches to convert their graveyards changed, depended upon each cemetery. The First Baptist Church of Philadelphia, which has been in the news the last five years, because they made a conscious decision. We can't maintain this. It's expensive. It's not looking good. We're in the business of saving souls, not cemetery business. So they bought, it's quite literally a 500 by 500 foot plot. And they contacted everybody, said, if you want your people moved with their stone, you got to give us money. Otherwise, we're going to take everybody. And they took everyone and put them in a mass grave in the center, put a monument over them. And then they took the original stones and they made a walkway. So there's literally, everyone who's had a stone, you know who's there because you can walk. So Betsy was interred, I think it was soon after the cemetery started in 1855. And it was the Quaker burial grounds at 4th or 5th and Arch in Philadelphia. And they wanted the land. And they were like, why is this land being taken by dead people? Let's move them out and use it for something else. And that's what happened to First Baptist. It later became a hat factory. And in 2015, they discovered the remains of another 600 people that they hadn't moved as they were building a condo. So the land in Center City was valuable, and people had a way out.
That's interesting. So we have just a couple minutes left, but we do have a couple people asking about the current state of Mount Moriah. And if you could just let us know when it closed, and I know it's no longer burying people. And then also if you could let people know how they can get in contact to either look up family members they may have, or how they can help the Friends of Mount Moriah.
So the answer to that question is go to the website to both answers. So I can bring it up on the screen if you want, but we do have a map of the sections and whether they're cleared or not. There's sections that are maintained on a regular basis. There's sections that are cut maybe twice a year just to make it usable for people to visit. And then there's some sections that we recommend you just come during the winter because the vegetation will be a lot easier to go through. So we estimate that we're about 70% through restoring the entire cemetery to a walkable area, but you can walk the roads, you can walk the cleared sections. It's really quite pretty. If we had more time, I could show you pictures of how beautiful it is. And there's birds and there's people there all the time jogging, enjoying it. As far as volunteering, if you go to the Friends of Mount Moriah website, there's a volunteer button, and that will go to the appropriate people. There's opportunities such as we have what's known as cradle graves, which are small but sided, and there's a program at Woodlands and at Laurel Hill that we're emulating where people adopt it and they plant flowers and they're absolutely positively beautiful. There's a couple scientific studies going on studying the biodiversity. My historical committee looks up people and we're developing a walking tour with an app. So, one of the difficulties of being a volunteer is we can't be there all the time. So we figured if we had an app and, as you're walking or it will talk to you and tell you about this monument or tell you about the history. So there's a lot of opportunities, and you can go to the website, you can find us on Facebook and volunteer. Yeah, there's one question. We have ancestors who are buried here. Who would I contact to find where they're located? Again, on the website, or you can visit the Facebook group. All we ask is, you have some sort of approximation of when your ancestor died. The records up until 1977 are available on ancestry.com. They're no longer available on the Pennsylvania Historical Society. Their website for this went down and they haven't brought it back up again. So we can look it up for you. You can look it up on Ancestry. We can look it up if you send a private email, or if you don't mind publicly declaring that you're looking for somebody, you could post it as a single post on our Friends of Mount Moriah website, and usually within a couple hours someone will find it.
That's quick. And I think we put a bunch of links in the chat, so people, we encourage you all to go visit their website and learn more. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great night. Bye-bye.